Hey everyone, I'm back again with another video for you all. This time I'm going to be starting with pallets, and we are going to see what we can turn these into. Now, breaking apart pallets is very challenging, so I recommend you pick up one of these if you decide to do this. This is called a pallet buster, and it'll make your life a whole lot easier. I didn't have one of these yet, so I am here struggling to break these down using pry bars and a hammer. A lot of the boards are breaking, but I was able to salvage some and use the wood. I did at one point use a jigsaw in order to salvage some of the boards without damaging them from this pallet. Alright, well, as you can see, this was not the best method for dismantling this pallet. Also, I think this pallet wasn't in very good condition. I think I've got a few boards here that I'll be able to salvage, but most of it's going to end up as firewood. So that is one benefit of pallets. We're going to be doing a fire pit in the summer, and this will all just feed that fire. So I'm going to save what I can, but I'm going to try a different method for these next pallets so I don't do as much damage. So before continuing, I did some research and discovered this little trick using some 2x4s to create a little bridge. This props up the pallet suspended from that single board. And then using another board and a hammer, I would pound the frame down, which would force that board up. This worked okay. It did prevent damage to the boards when they were being forced out. I believe this would have worked a lot better using a sledgehammer if I had one, because the normal hammer just did not produce enough force a lot of the times. And often I would just obliterate my sacrificial pieces of wood. After struggling with this for so long, I caved and bought myself a pallet buster. And having one of those made this process a lot easier, though I didn't get any footage of that, unfortunately. I did, however, bruise up my left thumb from missing my sacrificial wood a few times. The next order of business was to plane down all of these boards. I had a lot of these boards to get through, and I was planing everything down to a 1/2 inch if it was possible, and if anything was too thin, I would plane it down to 3/8 of an inch. But this took me a full day, so I'm going to zip through this all for you. There were a couple times where my planer found some hidden nails, unfortunately, so I pretty much had to order some replacement blades right away. This also filled my 16-gallon shop vac with wood chips about 3 separate times. And I knew the shop vac was full when the planer started spitting a lot more wood chips out of the front. Next, it was time to rip down all the 1/2 inch thick boards down to 3/4 of an inch or just over that. The boards that were planed down to 3/8 of an inch are not going to work for this project, so I'm going to be using those for something else. This also took me quite a while due to the sheer number of boards that I had. And you can see as I'm doing this, the pile of these 3/4 inch pieces just keeps growing around me. It's as if I was buried in them. Thankfully, my table saw did not find any more hidden nails. I was quite thankful for that, because frankly, the table saw just scares me. And I don't show them all, but there are a lot of cleanup sessions during all of this. Next, I'm going to be taking all of those strips and breaking them down even further using the miter saw, and I'm going to be cutting these down into 16-inch strips. There's no particular reason for 16 inches, I just picked that number. It could have been longer or shorter and still would have worked, but 16 is just where I landed. Alright, well, I've got about 100 of these 16-inch pieces that are the size, so I've got these buckets full of them. And now we're just going to start rearranging those in a kind of butcher block orientation so that we can get a shelf that's roughly 11 to 12 inches wide, and then we'll glue everything up and then we'll plane it and get going. Alright, so I started off with just a dry fit for all these first to kind of see how many rows I needed to do to get the measurements I wanted. And I had to decide on an overall length for this shelf that I'm going to be putting together. Now I had 2 buckets full of the 16-inch pieces, but in a separate bucket I also saved all the offcuts that were under 16 inches, and I used those on the ends where I needed something shorter. This was to help it all fit on my makeshift workbench here, which is just a plastic folding table. But the table definitely keeps me off the ground and my back appreciates that. Alright, so I got everything arranged. Now I'm trying to figure out a way to glue this up with all these little pieces. I think what I'm going to do is use a little trick with a pin nailer, and I'm going to turn the small strips into long strips for their particular row. Those will be held together, making it much easier to clamp up. So we're going to give that a shot and go from there. I know this method looks a little bit questionable and is hard to see, but I can assure you no fingers were harmed while I was doing this. But basically I'm butting the 2 pieces together and then shooting in the pin nail at an angle from both sides to create kind of an X to hold them together. Alright, first tests. It does hold them together, but I was using some pin nails that were a little too long. They were going through to this underlayment I'm using as a flat surface. So I switched to some shorter ones, and the ones that poke through a little bit, I'm just going to use some flush snippers to cut those off flush. So despite switching to the shorter pin nails, I still had issues with them going through, and I just kept using the flush cutters to trim those off when they would poke out. Once everything was connected, I started spreading the glue on these sides so that I could get everything glued up and clamped. I did have a little bit of a mess up when I realized I added glue to the last one and had to clean that off since it doesn't need glue. Then once I got to the halfway mark, I added some clamps to clamp these all together. And I added a clamp every 6 to 8 inches. Alright, that's 1.5 down. We just got to get the other half pinned and glued up. This time I made sure not to add glue to the last row. Once the 2 halves were glued and dried, I went ahead and glued those 2 halves together, giving me a total shelf depth of about 11.5 inches. I then did all the same steps for the second shelf. Now after the glue up, there was definitely some imperfections, which is why I cut all these pieces to above 3/4 of an inch, because the plan was to plane these shelves down to exactly 3/4 of an inch. After that, I used the miter saw to quickly cut off these ends that weren't going to be used, and the goal for the overall length of these shelves is going to be 36 inches. Alright, hey everyone. So The next step, I've got the shelves all done. So what I'm going to be doing now is I've actually set aside a few of the oak strips that were part of the pallets. And I'm going to use those since they're all pretty uniform in color and a much darker color. I'm going to use those as a frame, a contrasting frame to go around the shelves and hold them up. So that's what we're working on, getting all the pieces cut down, and we'll see how it looks in the end. So while I was doing this, I used a stop block to get some consistent cuts on some of the shorter pieces. The plan I came up for this was to use kind of a laminated construction technique using 3 layers of these strips of wood. I would glue all those together, and in the middle layer I would leave gaps in order to create kind of a mortise and tenon joint. And those joints are where the crossbars will slot into where the shelves will be resting on top. Once everything was cut, I would glue all the pieces together and clamp them down and wait for it to dry. An important note here is that the legs, once the glue dries, will be able to be planed, but it's very important not to plane the crossbars that are going to be holding the shelves, because we need them to retain their dimensions in order to slot into the joints snug. And here you can get an idea of how the crossbars are going to be laid out in that laminated method. So these are the legs after they have dried and they've also been planed. Now I'm just taking a round over bit to just barely round over these corners. I don't want it to be too prominent of a rounded edge, so I'm just doing enough to take it off and make it so that it's not sharp. And some people like rounded edges, but I am a sucker for a chamfered edge. So here I'm taking these shelves and adding a chamfered edge to them. Routers can be quite messy. Next, I sanded down the shelves with a 180 grit sandpaper, which I didn't need to do at this point because there's going to be much more sanding later. The legs, however, were ready for sanding. Now there is some pine incorporated to these shelves, so that means there's going to be some knots. And to seal those knots, I am using a clear epoxy and just pouring that over each knot, as well as any old nail holes that are exposed. My only gripe with using this really is the time it takes. As soon as I pour this stuff, the project is on pause for a full 24 hours for it to cure. Using a heat gun on the epoxy resin after a few minutes just takes care of any bubbles that are appearing. I first treated the legs and cross braces with a pre-stain conditioner and then used a very dark oil-based wood stain to give them that dark look and really try to get as much of a contrast as I could. The color I was using here is Espresso from Varathane. I let the frame parts dry overnight with the wood stain, and then the next day I went ahead and glued them up and assembled them. I added glue to the inside of the leg and then on the outside of the cross brace, and then tapped that in with a mallet. I then added some clamps just for some added security. Now moving back to the shelves, it's time for all that additional sanding. I am using a 120 grit here, something a little bit more aggressive to help tear down all that excess resin. Then with all the dust removed, I noticed there were still some gaps, so I took some wood glue and sawdust from my sander and went around and filled any other gaps I could find. And using a mixture of wood glue and the sawdust from my sander ensures that the tone of this as a filler matches the shelf much better than wood filler would. And of course, more sanding to get rid of any excess wood glue. Alright, with sanding done, it was time to add our pre-stained conditioner to these shelves. After that, I moved on to staining with an oil-based stain, this time from Minwax. This color was Special Walnut, and I didn't want it to get too dark, so immediately after applying, I was wiping it away with a clean cloth. Surprise! I made a third shelf because I had enough material. This one's gonna have an under bevel, and I used a miter saw on the ends and the table saw for the long end. Now this shelf is going to go on the wall, so I had to cut these pieces that are going to be for the brackets, and I'm just routing the front facing edges to match the routing I did on the legs. Now the under bevel was cut already, but there was still a sharp edge on the top, so I just used a round over bit with my router to take care of that. This shelf is getting all the same treatment the others did, starting off with the epoxy resin. And sadly, I had to give this 24 hours before I could continue working on this one. The shelving brackets I got pinned and glued at the 90-degree part, and one of these had a long crack down the oak portion here, and so I just filled all that in with epoxy resin, which gave it a cool look in the end. Here's a quick look at all the epoxy that was applied for this shelf and the brackets. Then it was time to get the protective coat on the other parts. I'm using a water-based polyurethane and giving everything about 3 coats, using a foam brush to apply it all. Now I apparently forgot to hit record when I was putting this together, but essentially all I did was measure out where the shelves would go. I then recessed some holes for screws on the bottom side of the cross braces and then screwed the shelves into place. I also added some wood glue before screwing them down to give some extra strength, and that's why I have the clamps on here. Moving back over to the wall mounted shelf, I'm just sanding all of the resin off of everything, along with giving everything an all-over sand. Now, since this shelf could be mounted high enough to see the bottom, I am going to be sealing and finishing the bottom as well. I am always flipping these little guys over and hoping I don't step on any of them. And here we're just working on final sanding for the shelf, and then pre-stain conditioning everything before finally staining everything to match with a dark color for the brackets and the special walnut on the shelf. Next, I marked center and decided some points to drill some mounting holes, and I just used a pocket hole drill bit for this with the collar set to the depth I wanted. And then before final assembly, I got the protective coating added. I then measured in 1/5 from each end of the shelf and marked the placement for the brackets, drilled some pilot holes, and then got those attached. I feel it's important here to tighten these in by hand so that you don't strip anything or cause any damage. And I'll see you at the before and after. Okay, so somewhat jokingly, but here is the before. It's just a pile of pallets I picked up that I found on Facebook Marketplace that were posted for free. And there was a mixture of oak and pine pallets. And here is the after. I wanted a contrasting look with the lighter wood shelves and a darker wood frame. I went with a 2-shelf design for this bottom portion that would sit on the floor, and then just above there we have the matching wall hanging shelf with the handmade brackets. Alright everybody, well, that's another project done. Breaking down pallets and processing them into usable wood is quite the chore. But I think in time I'll be able to, one, not only pick out better pallets, but also be able to process them a bit faster now that I'm a bit more familiar with the tools used for it. I did have a lot of fun doing this project. The creative process for this is just a lot of fun for me. I love creating new things, and I really liked how the butcher block style of this came out. I'll post an update once this sells to see what it's worth, at least in my area, because you know, every area is going to be different. Let me know your thoughts on what you think this would be worth or what you'd be willing to pay in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to drop a like and of course subscribe if you want to see more projects like this in the future. And we'll see you in the next one. Take care.